Hi, my name is Chris Graham, and I'm the founder of Tell People, where I teach storytelling and communication to professionals, people like you. I've teamed up with the folks at UXRC to produce this video, which will help you convert what was originally meant as a talk for a live audience into a talk for digital video. What we're going to cover in the video is listed at the side of the screen. We're going to start by talking about how to organize your material to make it easy for people to follow along. Then we're going to talk about your slides. And we're going to talk about three things. First, why images are better than text. Then why simple images are better than complex images. And finally, how you can interact with your slides on video. The last thing we're going to talk about is your presence on screen. Because as I'm sure you can appreciate, talking to a live audience for 30 minutes is very different from talking to a camera for 30 minutes. The last thing I want to say before we get started is that I know this audience watching the video has a lot of experience making presentations. And so while we think the content is useful and interesting, it's possible that you might not. And that's okay. If you look at the bottom of your screen, we've marked all of the sections in a time-elapsed bar so that you can jump around to what you think is most useful. We'll also flash the table of contents every time we transition between sections, again, so it's easy for you to jump around. So let's talk first about organizing your material, making it easy for people to follow along. I'm sure most of you are familiar with signposting or road mapping, which means starting your talk by letting people know what you're going to say. If you want to see an example of this, you can go back to the beginning of this video and watch how I laid out exactly what we were going to talk about. Talking to a live audience for 30 minutes. What I want to suggest to you is that signposting takes on added significance when you're not talking to a live audience. In particular, I want you to think about signposting both at the beginning of your talk and every time you transition between points. For example, if your talk has 4 points, before you start point 2, remind people about point 1. Before you start point 3, remind people about points 1 and 2, etc., etc. At every transition, remind people how you got to where you currently are. Because remember, unlike you, the people watching your talk are seeing it for the first time. Here's another way to think about it. It is very easy to command people's attention when you're talking to them live. You can see the audience, and the audience can see each other. So there's a lot of social pressure to pay attention, right? It's very awkward for people to start looking around, checking their phone, things like this. But a person who's watching your talk on their computer is constantly distracted. Just think about what's happening to you right now. I'm sure some of you have multiple computer screens open. Everybody has a phone. Maybe there's people where you're at. Maybe you're having a snack. It's just not realistic to expect a person watching a video to be laser focused for 30 minutes. So help them out by signposting at the beginning and every time you transition through your talk. Let's move on to your slides. So now that we know how to make it easy for people to follow along, let's talk about what people are going to see on their screen, which in addition to your face, is your slides. And in particular, I want to talk about 3 aspects of slide design: images versus text, simple images versus complex images, and finally, how to interact with the slides on your screen. Okay, first, let's talk about images versus text. Have you ever noticed that while almost everybody agrees that text-heavy slides are bad, lots of people continue to produce text-heavy slides? This is an example of a text-heavy slide. So I think the reason this happens is that the vast majority of your communication involves words and numbers. Think about your own life. Most of the time you talk to people, write them emails, text messages, and maybe you make some spreadsheets. So when the majority of your communication is words and numbers, I don't think it's surprising that when you sit down to write a deck, you reach for words and numbers. What I want you to do is the opposite. I'd like you to reach for images, and there are 2 reasons why. So first, images are the most efficient way to communicate large amounts of information. Imagine how long it would take to narratively describe just 1 frame of this video. That's a lot of information that you can either tell people or show them a picture. The second reason to prefer images over text has to do with how your brain processes information. I'm sure most of you are familiar with a serial versus a parallel process. A parallel process is 2 things happening at once. A serial process is 2 things that appear to happen at once, but in fact are happening one after the other very rapidly. Human attention is a serial process, which means that when people are watching your talk, they can do one of three things. They can listen, they can read your slides, or they can think about what you're saying. This is why having lots of text is exhausting. It forces people to cycle through listen, read, think, listen, read, think. And you know what happens when people get exhausted? They stop paying attention. Remember, images are better than text because that's the quickest way for people to absorb the information on your slide and get back to listening to your talk. Which is why instead of putting all of these points on a slide, we started this section by showing you an image of a bad slide, and we'll finish by showing you an image of a good slide. So now that we know why images are better than text, let's think about why simple images are better than complex images. So when you think about images, you probably imagine one of two types, an infographic or a picture. Now I know this audience is very familiar with infographics, things like a graph or maybe a custom illustration. And I'm sure you also know what a picture is. People are going to be watching your talk on a laptop screen, a tablet, or possibly even their phone. Which means if you have a complex, dense infographic that looks great on a big screen, it's going to be hard to follow on a small screen. It also means that a graph with lots of overlapping trend lines will be easy to follow on a big screen, but not so much on a small screen. And finally, if you have a photo with lots going on, that'll work great on a big screen, but maybe not as a thumbnail. It's kind of like watching the movie Titanic on an airplane. So remember, when you're putting together your slides and thinking about images, try to keep it simple. So now that we know why images are better than text and why simple images are best, the last point to make is about interacting with your slides on screen. And that point is, you basically can't. So one of the nice things about doing a live presentation is that you can walk around the screen and point at your slides. So if you have a big graph, you can walk over and point at part of the graph. Or if you have a complex infographic, you can walk over and point at part of the infographic. For better or worse, you really can't do that with this format. So let me give you two workarounds. First, as we just talked about, you can use simple images that people can understand at a glance. Second, if you really want to point at something, you can print off your slide and hold it, and then point at the image. This also lets the audience know that you appreciate the barriers they face in really experiencing your talk. So let's recap briefly what we've covered so far. We started by talking about signposting and the importance of letting people know what you're going to say. And then we talked about how to make good decisions about your slides. The last thing we're going to talk about is your presence on screen.
What happens if, oh my God.
Depending on how you feel about public speaking, the audience is either the best or worst part of the experience. If you love the spotlight, the audience is the best. If you hate the spotlight, the audience is the worst. The thing to notice is that in either case, the audience is a major source of energy for you as a speaker, and you are going to miss that energy when you talk to a camera. So here's what I want you to do. As much as possible, record your tape in front of a live audience. If you live with people, make them watch. If you don't live with people and you can manage it with social distancing, have them come over. And if you can't manage it with social distancing, get somebody on a video call and put the phone next to your camera. Watching people react to what you say is a major part of what animates you as a public speaker. So unless you're a professional actor or crushing it on TikTok, try to record in front of a live audience. And that's everything I have to share with you. Remember, signposting, simple images, and recording in front of a live audience. You're already doing great. So a major challenge of any talk is figuring out how much you can say in the time available. Most people err on the side of including too much, which always makes the talk feel rushed. So let me tell you how you can get this exactly right every single time. The first thing to do is make a list of all the important things that you want to cover in your talk. So that's the key points, the big ideas, the relevant case studies. So let's say you make this list and there are 5 things or topics that you want to cover. That means in a 30-minute talk, you get 5 minutes per topic with a little bit left over for an intro and a conclusion. So now the question is, How much can you say in 5 minutes? Well, it turns out that a good speaking rate for most people is 100 words a minute. So for each topic, you get 500 words. And how much is 500 words? It's about 2 pages of text, double-spaced. And that's the hack. You take the amount of time available, divide by the number of points you want to make, and multiply that number by 100. That's the number of words that you get for each point. It's not a perfect formula, but it's a really good place to start. And I promise it will never cause you to go over time. Thanks so much for listening. I can't wait to see what you come up with.